friend of mine and a very distinguished scholar who currently is mixing scholarship with public service as a special advisor to the U.S. government on Afghanistan. Vali Nasr, as you can see from the biographical information I think in front of you, is well regarded as one of the leading scholars on contemporary Islam, and that indeed is going to be a theme, I think, in the talk that we are about to hear. There are many reasons that we're delighted to welcome Professor Nasr to MEI, and we're grateful that the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs invited him to come to Singapore as one of their distinguished academic visitors. Professor Nasr is going to be speaking to us on a subject, the two key words of are extremely interesting to us at MEI and NUS and people in Singapore generally. One of them is economics, and the other is extremism. And what the linkage might be between economics and extremism in the Middle East, or indeed across what is now sometimes called the global South, is something that I think our speaker is very well equipped to discuss, and I suspect he will be offering some very original ideas about the relationship between economics and extremism. Professor Nasr is a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University in Boston, and he was telling me just now that he's been able to negotiate his academic chores with the demands of the U.S. government for his expertise on one of the most difficult foreign policy situations that the United States faces. So, without further ado, I will introduce Professor Nasr, let him speak, and we will follow our usual procedures. After he finishes speaking, we will have a question and answer session, and I'm sure there will be many questions and comments, and he has agreed to handle as many as we can fit in during the time available to us. So, ahlan wa sahlan to MEI, and we look forward to your talk.
Very much. Thank you.
You're wired? Okay.
Wired, yes. Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure being here at MEI, and let me begin by thanking Ambassador Matthews, Dr. Hodson, and the Middle East Institute for inviting me here. The topic of this discussion is based on work that I've been doing for many years on the issue of the role of Islam in politics, and particularly the debates that have taken over since 9/11 in the West, in particular, about the direction in which the Muslim world is going, the role of extremism, and where that might eventually end up. Let me say, I don't want to get into a debate as to whether these perceptions of the current intellectual and political trends in the Muslim world are correct or not. Let's assume that they are, at least in the minds of many who, in academia, in policy-making circles, debate these things. They are quite real, and the concerns they have are also quite real. But the way in which this issue has been discussed is that, the problem lies, if you would, with a particular approach to interpretation of Islam and its role in society and politics. And often the only escape route out of this is seen to be some form of reformation or reform of Islam. And we often have read articles, works where there is a call for a enlightened leader, enlightened cleric, enlightened intellectual who would liberalize the interpretation of Islam in a way in which would not only do away with the problematic of extremism, but also put the developments in the Muslim world on the same trajectory as other regions who have recently undergone transformation in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, or in Eastern Europe. Needless to say that this perception clearly comes from a reading of Western history itself, namely the belief that ultimately the path to economic development, progress, democracy in the West went through a axial shift in religious thinking that separated it from politics and did away from some of the beliefs that were quote-unquote incompatible with development of modernity. Now, as attractive as that sounds, one can think that what really those who advocate these ideas wish for is not actually reformation, is not really post-reformation Islam, but really post-industrial revolution Islam. Because after all, the Reformation was far from a liberal endeavor. It was actually extremely puritanical. One can think of Calvin's Geneva or John Knox's Scotland as much closer to the Taliban's Kabul, if you take the guns away, than it is to any kind of a conception of the liberal West. Whatever were the long-run consequences of Reformation were long-run. In other words, there was no immediate, if you would, snapping of religious, conservative religious belief into some form of liberal ideas. Now, I think if we even took the argument about the importance of European history to interpreting where Islam is and where can it go from this point forward, economics matters significantly, and often it's not part of the discourse in a very meaningful way about these issues. Now, at some level, everybody understands that there is a relationship between economics in the Muslim world and extremism, in the sense that we understand that many of parts of the Muslim world, particularly where we perceive to be the greatest problems with conservative attitudes or extremism, are not doing well economically, that they have large public sectors that are not creating jobs, that economies are stagnant, that there is growing poverty in many parts of the Muslim world. There's a growing discrepancy of wealth between the rich and the poor, and the prognosis is not good, namely because in Muslim country after Muslim country, the demographic pyramid is becoming flatter and flatter, namely you have younger and younger populations, that you look all the way from North Africa to Bangladesh, that in country after country, over the majority of the population are categorized as youth. Sometimes the majority of the population are essentially in their teenage years, which means that you have a bulge of labor coming into the market now with very little prospects for jobs or hope for prosperity. We're actually seeing this manifest itself in riots in Tunisia and Algeria in the past week. But you know, there is an argument out there that poverty and lack of hope breeds extremism. And therefore, now regardless of whether this is actually proven, but it is an assumption. It's a very powerful assumption out there, which tells you that the problematic of extremism has to do with the fact that there is too many poor people, and it's essentially a poverty issue and an income inequality issue. Now, the argument I would make is that actually there is a fair statement there. that there is a great deal of political tension born of the economic reality in the Muslim world. And as I said, it's not going better. I think a 2009 or 2008 Arab Development Report suggested that the Arab world would have to create 115 million new jobs by 2015 just to meet the demand. And that's not, in other words, getting ahead of the growth curve. But my argument is that the problem in the Muslim world fundamentally is not that there is too much lower class, but that there is too little middle class. And that, again, that is something that and I'll explain, that has reflection also in the fundamental historical changes that Europe went through, that brought it through the medieval period into Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, and forward. Now, what is a middle class? Let's start with a definitional construct. Economists, despite the different ways in which they may measure it, have a sort of a tip of the finger definition of the middle class. That middle class enough are people who at least have regular jobs, have regular income, and at least can put away a third of their disposable income account after putting aside housing, food, and other necessary staples. Put that aside, at least a third of their income they could dedicate to discretionary spending, spending on things other than basics. Now, by that count, there is a middle class in many parts of the Muslim world. In some places it's larger, in some places it's smaller. For instance, if we took a country like Pakistan, where the image is often of poverty and extremism, still by this definition, something probably close to 30 million of the population would qualify as having this form of a disposable income, which is larger than probably the population of the country of Iraq all put together. But not every middle class is actually the right form of middle class. In the Middle East, the middle class emerged in the way in which we know it, as built top-down by secularizing states who took the job of development and creating new societies from the 1920s, when the experiment began in Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk forward. And over time, you have a middle class that is largely dependent on the state. It's either salary-taking middle class, or even in the business sector is dependent on government contracts and entitlements. The middle class that really matters, which is quite lacking in the Muslim world, is what in the European terminology we refer to as independent bourgeoisie, which means a middle class which is not dependent on the government or the state, but is dependent on the markets. It is not consuming wealth created by the government, but rather it's generator of wealth. And if I would say there is a difference, say, in middle class, say, in Turkey today, than there is a middle class in Saudi Arabia or the rest of the Gulf, where the economic status is guaranteed and provided by the government, not by market forces. Now, if we thought about the Muslim world, we often, the assumption is that what separates the Muslim world from the rest of the world, and this is an argument that one often hears, is that the Muslim world is separated from the rest of the world because of its religiosity, and because it's subscribing to a different set of values and has a different conception of politics, society, and history. But actually, the more poignant, I would say, distinction of large parts of the Muslim world is that it's outside of globalization. It's outside of the economic relationships that are now defining global relations, or at least in the past 20 years have been critical in defining global relations, that have been critical to transformation of areas like Eastern Europe, Latin America, or East Asia. Now, let me clarify. I mean, there is a lot of trade between Muslim countries and the West, but selling oil and buying finished manufactured products from the West is not what we mean by integration into globalization. Integration into globalization means being part of the supply chain and manufacturing chain and services chain that connects many different economies together. I mean, in the United States, for instance, the example would be that if you went to Walmart, which I'm not sure everybody's familiar here, but these sort of mega stores that manufacture things in Asia and sell them abroad, you hardly will find something that is said made in Saudi Arabia. You wouldn't find anything that says made in Saudi Arabia. You would hardly find anything that says it's made in the Arab world, for instance, which means that the Arab world is not participating in the global economy in the way in which Malaysia, Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, and these countries are doing. Now, why is that significant? It is significant at many levels, but one of the reasons why it's significant is that because this engagement in globalization, despite all the criticisms that is being made of it today because of the downturn in the financial markets, etc., has been transformative to those regions. Not only because globalization helped change economies, produce jobs, produce wealth, but because it produced the middle class. Whether it's in Argentina, or it's in Brazil, or it's in Eastern Europe, the integration into the global economy, prevalence of commerce in these economies, prevalence of trade, produced a class that then political stability and political moderation, and even religious moderation is anchored in that class. Now, by that standard, large parts of the Muslim world have not had that experience and therefore are lacking in that class. Now, historically in Europe, the class that accounts for the major cultural, religious, and political transformation of the world is this middle class. And often the lesson is lost on the West, looking at its own history as a guide for where the Muslim world ought to go, is that the major transformation in the West did not come because of Reformation, but really became because of Industrial Revolution and the creation of this middle class. And even if we looked at the example of Asia, if we went back 20, 30 years, analyses that would be done at that point in time about Confucian cultures was not very different from analyses that may be done about Islamic cultures today, as being close to global trends, as being antagonistic towards capitalism. And what we saw was that economic globalization did produce a middle class, whether it's in China or in Southeast Asia or in other parts of Asia, that is playing a role similar to the one that the middle classes or the bourgeoisie played in Europe itself. Now, the argument, therefore, is that if there were to be such a middle class, that perhaps we would see different trends at work in the Muslim world. And there are small pockets in the Muslim world where you are beginning to see the presence of such a middle class. And where you see the presence of such a middle class, you do see sometimes very different attitudes, at least different attitudes than the ones that are perceived in the West about the Muslim world and Muslims. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's first talk about Dubai. Dubai has been a phenomenon in the Muslim world in the past decade, let's say. And I'm not going to sort of tout the virtues of Dubai as a business investment opportunity. Clearly, that's no longer there. But I have to say that Dubai ran into trouble because it was part of the global economy. If it wasn't part of the global economy, it wouldn't have run into trouble. And the one thing that Dubai proved is that Muslims can be equally reckless capitalists as everybody else, and that therefore they're not sort of immune somehow to follies of capitalism. But I think the significance of Dubai is not that it is a business miracle and it's going to keep growing and making money for people. I think Dubai is a proof of concept about Muslim attitudes towards capitalism and what that would do to the mindset. Dubai, it was the poorest of the Emirates in the Gulf. It's producing less oil today than it was producing 10 years ago. It had to come up with new ideas about how to generate wealth. And actually one of the models it did look at and was very influential on Dubai was Singapore. Dubai conceived of an environment, of a regulatory environment, of a sort of a virtual market for the region, where people who could not practice capitalism in their own countries could come to Dubai and behave as capitalists. People who could not engage the global economy in their own countries could come to Dubai and engage the global economy. So it became a place where Iranians, Pakistanis, Uzbeks, Jordanians, Lebanese came and did business with Chinese, Russians, Americans, Englishmen, etc. And regardless of whether those investments were wise or not, or whether they were excessive or not, the proof was that if there is a capitalist environment, if there is a free market environment, Muslims are likely to behave as equally capitalistic as anybody else. In fact, the most significant point about Dubai was that Dubai created a structured financial and business marketplace that was integrated into the global economy, deliberately integrated into the global economy. And it became a virtual place where Muslims who could not participate in the global economy could engage the global economy via Dubai. Now, on the other side of it is also equally interesting, namely that in 2008-2009, surveys taken in various parts of the Muslim world found that Muslims for the first time preferred to live in Dubai and vacation in Dubai more than any other country in the world. For the first time, more than United States and United Kingdom. And the people who obviously looked to vacationing or living in Dubai were people whose profile would be the middle class in Dubai. Now, the reason they liked Dubai was not because Dubai was some kind of an austere place where Islamic law ruled. That it was not that. It was that Dubai was became for them a cross between Las Vegas and Disneyland, and a shopping attraction. They went to Dubai because they were interested in consumption. And in fact, in many ways, Dubai is the antithesis of Al-Qaeda. It's not about the other world. It's about this world. It's about capitalist consumption of the kind that the West is very familiar with. And those who go to Dubai, and why Dubai became so attractive to many Muslims, particularly Muslim middle classes, was that it allowed for quality of living. It showed that when wealth is generated, what Muslims demand is quality of life. I remember one time I was talking to a businessman who was in Dubai, and he said, I like Dubai because in Dubai you stay in 5-star hotels and you pray in 5-star mosques. And it's the cleanliness, it's the quality, it's the upward mobility that was attractive. So what Dubai shows is that many of the attitudes that are outside assumed about Muslims, about their religion, about what the religion tells them, actually doesn't hold in Dubai. As I said, the whole concept of Dubai, the imaginary concept that it has evolved about Dubai in the thinking of the Muslim world is exactly opposite of what the West assumes about fundamentalism, conservative attitudes, and about particularly about extremism. Now, Dubai also showed us other things, namely that for the time being, Muslims are likely to want to consume things that are obviously have an Islamic tenor to them. The reason they prefer Dubai to Western destinations is because it's an Islamic milieu, because there are mosques, 5-star or otherwise, and also because Dubai does provide for certain Islamic consumption habits. I mean, the most important of these Islamic consumption goods is today Islamic finance. This is Islamic finance was an idea that actually fundamentalist thinkers like Maulana Maududi of Pakistan came up with in the 1950s. For them, it was an ideological trope to say that Islam is neither capitalism nor socialism and is better than both of them. and Islam has everything self-contained in it, including economics. But it was an idea that sounded good, but it never worked. They could never make it work. It was never economically viable, unless governments subsidized it in countries like Pakistan or Egypt and the like. Now, Islamic finance today is the fastest growing area of global finance. It grew, it is about $4 to $5 trillion industry. That's not much in the terms of the global financial markets, but it's growing rapidly. And during the period of economic downturn of 2008, 2009, it actually grew by 30%, by about $820 billion in terms of size. Now, how come it began? How come Islamic economics and Islamic finance became viable? Is because Western banks, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Citibank, decided to put their mind to make Islamic finance viable. And the reason they decided to got attracted to this market, because they realized that there is demand. And there is demand because there is, this is finance is also a consumption good. And therefore, there is a desire to engage financial markets, although on Islamic terms. Now, in the Gulf, one might say that much of the money for Islamic finance may have had to do with the oil boom of 2008, 2009, when oil went to about $140 a barrel. But there's plenty of evidence in the West that the same trend is at work. For instance, a bank in Chicago in the United States in 2009 decided to offer Islamic car loans. The very first day that it offered the car loans, there was a line around the block to apply for Islamic car loans. Now, people who buy cars tend to be people who have disposable income, who are middle class and above. This is not oil wealth. This is essentially attests to the fact that there is a large Muslim market that will engage, if you would, varieties of financial tools, etc. If the products are there, if the opportunity is there. And now, in Turkey, for instance, there is a burgeoning Islamic industries of all kinds, Islamic vacations, Islamic hotels. And what he essentially says, there is actually an eagerness to engage, if you would, the varieties of consumption habits that we associate with many other parts of the world. I mean, for now, the Muslims would like to do that, or there's a huge demand for things that are Islamically acceptable, but nevertheless, those goods are goods. In other words, the middle class in Turkey would like to take vacations, cruises, stay at hotels, and travel, and it is attracted to products that speak to that market. Now, the other, Dubai's impact on the region is often debated. There are things, people who travel to Dubai and see clean airports, can get telephones in 48 hours, can get a passport in a week, maybe go back to their own countries and demand similar kind of services from their own governments. But the more important, as I said, impact of Dubai is what it tells us about the potentiality of integration of the Muslim world into the global economy, of creation of a middle class whose consumption habits are similar, if you would, to what you would have of middle classes everywhere else. Now, on the other side of the Muslim world, the other country that I think speaks to this issue very prominently is Turkey. Turkey is a fairly developed country. It's now become a powerhouse, not just because of its foreign policy. Turkey economically is doing very well. It's a member of the G20 countries. There are two Muslim countries that are members of G20. One is Saudi Arabia. I think maybe UAE is there too, and the other one's Turkey. Those two owe their presence there because of enormous amount of oil wealth. Turkey is there because of enormous amount of wealth that is generated by the same kind of economic activities that has put India, Brazil, and South Korea in the G20 category. Turkey, in the past decade, has become a major attractor of direct foreign investment. It has attracted over $70 billion of direct foreign investment. Its economy has grown, at least until 2008, between 2002 and 2008, at a rate of 7% a year. Istanbul has become, not only a well sought after tourism destination, but it's become a huge business hub in the region. Now, we may say about Turkey that Turkey was developed by the Kemalist state. It was probably the most successful case of a state development in the region. Kemalism brought infrastructure to Turkey, industry to Turkey, education to Turkey, and also forcibly, in earlier parts of its history, secularized Turkey. And one might argue, well, Turkey was primed to make this transition into development because of the Kemalist experience. There is no doubt that what Kemalism invested in Turkey serves Turkey very well in terms of education, infrastructure, and many other issues. But the transformation of Turkey in the past decade did not happen under a Kemalist regime, but under something quite different, which is the AKP party, the sort of soft Islamism of Prime Minister Erdogan and President Gül and their circle of advisors. But the role that this younger generation of Islamic political activists were able to play is built on an economic transformation in Turkey. If we go back to 1980s or to 1980, when there was a military coup in Turkey, Turkish economy was in the same shape as Argentinian, Brazilian, and Mexican economy. In fact, Turkey at that time, under President Turgut Özal, went to the IMF. Its economy was bankrupt. Its inflation was in double digits. It didn't have quite the youth bulge of Algeria or Tunisia, but it was very clear that the economy was at a dead end. And the IMF gave the same prescription to Turkey that it gave to Argentina and Brazil, which is you need to devalue your currency, you need to remove your tariff barriers, you have to stop subsidizing these large enterprises that are losing money. You have to either privatize them or close them down. And you have to shift whatever money you have and whatever money the IMF may give you into encouraging exports. Right? Now, the Turkish economy then was very closely attached to the secular Kemalist government. And it was the big businessmen and big industrialists of Istanbul were likely to be the losers in the IMF gambit because they were protected by the government and they were subsidized by the government. The beneficiary of the change were those who were outside the system, who were agile to take advantage of this. And this, by and large, were small-town businessmen who happened to be more Muslim, more conservative, more beholden to Turkish values, and they took advantage. And the transformation of Turkey began to happen through that. In the middle of Anatolia, there is a small town, it's now actually grown to much larger size, by the name of Kayseri. It's not far from, maybe 4 hours drive south from Ankara. And Kayseri was a sleepy, little town, very conservative, I would say, sort of in American, if you would parlance, it would be Middle America, somewhere in Indiana or Ohio. And Kayseri took advantage of of these transformations. And small-town businessmen there who were conservative, were Muslim, but were fiercely capitalist, began to take government credit and support and invest in export industry. It is these businessmen who created direct relations of trade with Europe around the Turkish government often. So, they essentially, much like, say, Asian businessmen, began to do direct business with Europe and then later on with the United States. And the impact was tremendous. For instance, Kayseri is a major source of exports for denim jeans around the world. About, I think, 5 or 6%, maybe more, of all the denim jeans produced globally is produced in Kayseri. There is one company that produces 1% of all of the denim jeans in the world. There is not a single brand in the world that does not use Turkish fabric. And some of these companies are now the largest suppliers, particularly of jeans in Europe. And that's only one industry. There is also furniture industry, which is a big export producer in Kayseri, even though Kayseri is not near any forest or source of wood. And then there are other industries, leather, etc. Now, the transformation in Kayseri, as I said, was not done by the government. It was done by these businessmen. And why they did, and again, you know, it's a proof of concept before anything else. Namely, if you gave the capitalist opportunity, Muslims would behave in capitalist manner. It was the more Muslim Turks, the more Islamic Turks, who turned to capitalism first, not the more secular Turks. They were part of the state-controlled establishment in Turkey. In fact, in Turkey there are two business associations, Musiyad and Tusiyad. One is the old secular, larger businesses, business association. The other one is these, what they call Anatolian tigers, much more Muslim, much more, but much more capitalist and much more integrated into Europe. Now, what happened in Kayseri happened in the rest of Turkey as well, and the Turkish boom is really the product of this much more Muslim capitalist class that emerged in Turkey. Now, Kayseri also, and you know, the extent of this is quite impressive. I mean, for instance, you know, there are a number of now key brands globally that are owned by Turkish companies. You know, for instance, Godiva Chocolates is owned by a Turkish company. These companies now have sufficient money that they're investing in the Arab world, they're investing in Central Asia, they're investing everywhere else. Now the argument that we make today that, you know, Turkish foreign policy is becoming interested in the Middle East for business reasons means Turkish foreign policy is actually following Turkish businessmen. It is their money that's going into the region for construction, food products, varieties of other kinds of businesses, as well as exporting of Turkish goods that is driving Turkey's much more, at least that dimension of Turkish foreign policy, which is interested in protecting the Turkish business. Now, there is no question that with these businessmen and becoming much more important, they have brought Islam into the political process. I mean, the AKP party was built on the back of these businessmen. It was their party. In fact, you know, AKP party, when it first gained ground in 2002, was seen to be the party of the poor slums of Ankara and Istanbul, but now actually is a party of tycoons. It is a party that is dominated by extremely wealthy Turks who have done very well in this environment. And I remember about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I think, there was rumors of a coup in Turkey because the AKP party put forward President Abdullah Gül as candidate for president. And initially there was a pushback because he comes from an Islamist background. His wife wears a headscarf, and this was seen to be unacceptable, quote unquote, to have him become president of Turkey. And there was on the website of the Turkish military, Chief of Staff's military, there was a posting that hinted that the military may take action, which was in Turkey was referred to as the e-coup. Because it was declared online. And I remember I asked a Turkish businessman, one of these sort of types I'm describing, about, well, what would it mean for Turkey or for you if there was a military coup in Turkey? And he said nothing. Because any Turkish government now has to listen to us because we pay for the Turkish government. It is our taxes, it's our businesses that generate wealth. that business class or that middle class, that entrepreneur class's profile is hugely different from middle class that is beholden to if you would, to the government and to the state. Now, why is this Turkish, other than impressive numbers, why is this matter? First of all, again, if you look, it's an image of wealthy Islam. You can see the behavior of what wealthy middle class and of Muslims would do, and it's a far cry from the image that we have of that it is produced by 9/11, by extremism, by some of the images that we get from the Arab world or South Asia. Secondly, because it is this class that is the defender of democracy in Turkey, for very obvious reasons, because it serves their business interests. And it serves their relationship with Europe, which is greatly, these ties of business that goes directly from Kayseri to European markets or other small towns and from Turkey to European markets is served by the position and politics of the current government and an open environment in Turkey. But I also think that if you looked at Turkey, this development speaks exactly to the concern that I started my talk with, namely the concern in the West about excessive extremism and anti-modern, quote-unquote, or anti-globalization attitudes in the Muslim world. If you looked at, if you went to Kayseri, like in the middle of the town, there's a huge shining mosque. And on Fridays, there's a line of Mercedes-Benzes in front of it, which tells you, that there is a lot of wealth in that little city. Now, the people who, these businessmen are clearly more Muslim than the Kemalist establishment that they have replaced. But what is interesting is not that they are more Muslim or more practicing than what was there before, but is their attitudes towards religion which is key, which is they are interested in religion as a moral guide, not as not as political action. They are interested in capitalism, wealth, they're interested in security, stability, and all of these issues. And they are not interested in sort of confrontational politics that is supported by religion. And the reasoning for that is somewhat, I would say, simple. Namely, the way it's playing out often in Turkey is that the responsibility for the image of Turkey and the image of Islam is the responsibility of these businessmen, not of the government or not of a clerical establishment. So it becomes clear in talking to them that if you are selling leather to Ferragamo in Milan, or if you're selling jeans to Levi Strauss in Europe, jihad is not good for business. And it's very clear in their attitude that they are interested in Islam, but they're not interested in extremist interpretations of Islam. And in fact, if we looked around the Muslim world, outside of Turkey or wherever you have even pockets of the middle class, you're seeing you see beginnings of different approaches and attitudes. Within Turkey itself, the movement of Fethullah Gulen, which has been maybe familiar to many, that is being accredited for re-Islamization of Turkey. It clearly appeals to the middle class in terms of the values that it promotes. It's business friendly, it emphasizes self-realization and spirituality and community building, but it does not encourage hardline political action. It's not based on a demand for an Islamic state based on the Sharia, as say Jamaat-e-Islami or Muslim Brotherhood may ask. It's asking for personal Islamic piety and permission for Islam to be practiced within society, but it's perfectly happy to coexist and operate under the existing Turkish state. If you looked at, say, new Islamic voices, say, in the Arab world, some 280 satellite television channels in the Arab world. There's plenty of religious programming on them. Most of them are ones that you would expect to see, or many in the West would find familiar with to their own conception of what's going in the Muslim world. I mean, somebody like Yusuf Qaradawi has plenty of followers, but that's not interesting because that's what we expect. That goes within the expectations that are there of attitudes in the Muslim world. What is much more interesting is people like the Egyptian preacher Amar Khaled. Again, maybe familiar to some. He does not come from a clerical background. He wears three-piece suits or polo shirts when he gives his sermons. He's conservative on issues of hijab and many other issues, but he clearly promotes a very different approach to pluralism, to society, towards economy, etc. And then nowadays, actually, he doesn't live in Egypt. He lives in Europe. He travels around. He has. And when he preaches, it's not usually at mosques, it's at these grand halls or hotels, etc. And the key question is that who is the audience of Amar Khaled? And when you look around, who attends his big melees, the social profile is quite clear. That Amar Khaled appeals to the same kind of if you would, social strata that we were describing in Turkey, when we say that we patronize Dubai or is interested in that. Which means that Amar Khaled has a following only because of the growth of the middle class, even in a stultified small way in many parts of the Arab world. If we looked, for instance, to Iran, which last year went through a major political convulsion after the elections of 2009, the so-called Green Movement, which emerged demanding political change in the country. Its roots goes back to opening of the Iranian economy during the latter part of President Rafsanjani's presidency and throughout President Khatami's presidency. When the price of oil was low, the Iranian economy was hurting, and the government took concerted effort to privatize and open up a private sector. As small as it was, it had an impact of creating, if you would, a new middle class in Iran. That middle class was the source of support for the Green Movement, because that middle class, the minute that it emerged, it demanded quality of life, political freedoms, and greater engagement with the world. And if you looked at who was supporting the opposition candidate Mousavi's campaign, by and large were large businessmen who bankrolled the campaign, sort of equivalents of your Kayseri businessmen in Iran, and who voted for them was by and large the middle class. I mean, many claim that in fact the election may have been won in the end by President Ahmadinejad, but if you look at the distribution of voting as to where he may have won it, he won it in small towns and villages way outside. But in where the middle class dominated, there was the vote went opposed to him. And in fact, in many ways, the elections of 2009 in Iran was really an election between what the middle class and its political candidate and the lower class and its political candidate. It was a contest between populism, state control of the economy and distribution of wealth to the lowest classes, versus a candidate Mousavi, who throughout his campaign promised to further privatize and open the Iranian economy, and had a capitalist-friendly attitude. So, what this all means is essentially that you know, if we were to rethink about, you know, what is happening in the Muslim world and what would be the main, if you would, force for change, I think we're focused on the wrong thing, which is we're focused on religious debates. We're looking for a religious leader who would you know, somehow miraculously reinterpret the faith in a way that would make all the problems that the West sees in the Muslim world go away, whereas the much more important process has to be economic. And in some ways, you know, the agent of change in the Muslim world is not clerics or intellectuals, but it's going to be businessmen. And that is the much more important process to happen. Now, I mean, one might often say that, you know, if you looked at the 19 young men who were responsible for 9/11, or you looked at somebody like Faisal Shehzad, you know, the Pakistani American who tried to set a bomb off in Times Square, or to the young Nigerian boy who became the would-be Christmas bomber, that they all are, you know, have a middle-class profile. They're not poor. I mean, you know, maybe the Taliban or, you know, Hamas may recruit from among the disenfranchised youth as their foot soldiers, but, you know, terrorism of the kind we associate with Al-Qaeda is clearly targeting and using the middle class. So, you know, you might say, well, what's going on? The reality is that, you know, terrorism has always been a middle class phenomenon. If you looked at the Badr Meinhof gang, the Red Army faction, you know, they always were from the middle class. When I was a graduate student, you know, there was all kinds of theories about why the middle class produces revolutionaries. I mean, Che Guevara was a middle class. And it's always going to be that way. I mean, even in the United States, you know, all the radicals in Berkeley were all middle class. They were not poor, and they actually came from good families. And you know, there's a different reason why individuals in the middle class get attracted to radicalism and to terrorism. The key question is not that individual middle class children or young people get attracted to radicalism. They always will. They're always going to be that. The more important issue is that the middle class as a whole not be supportive of radicalism. And the reason why the Badr Meinhof gang or the Red Army faction or the Red Brigades in Italy, etc., never grew roots is because the middle classes in those countries as a whole was not sympathetic to terrorism. And the middle class that in the Muslim world would not be sympathetic to terrorism ultimately would have to have a vested interest in market forces, in commerce, in quality of life, and would have to have a sufficient position, as in Turkey, to be able to dictate culture and to be able to dictate politics. As we see in Turkey, that, you know, this new middle class is the anchor for both democracy and the quote-unquote soft Islamism and moderate implementation of it in society that's associated with the AKP party. Let me stop here and be very happy to hear your thoughts and questions.
Well, thank you very much for a really stimulating talk. I have a feeling there will be many comments and questions. And so I will ask you to identify yourself and try, if possible, to make your comment or question as succinct as possible so that we can entertain as many comments as time permits. And we have perhaps up to 45 minutes to continue. So the floor is open. Yes, sir, please.
Please introduce yourself.
V.K. Rajan from Chesterton, Suntec, Singapore. Professor, thank you very much. That's very interesting. Poverty breeds extremism. To me, much of the Muslim world is not poor. They have been made poor by bad governance. take the case of Pakistan. In our conversation, you said you have just come from there. The governor has been assassinated for saying that the blasphemy law should be reviewed, not repealed. The extremists said immediately that anybody who sympathized with him must be eliminated. So this is the ground reality. The politicians, the military, they have stoked this religious feeling right from the beginning for their own purpose. To create problems for others, probably, neighboring countries. So, how do we see this problem of middle class emerging? In the way you put it, that they will bring about the change that we all hope. I saw a little bit of a program where, after the floods, the surgeons were trying desperately to surgeries so badly needed, but the electricity failed. He was heard saying, we are a nuclear power, but we cannot have electricity to perform these basic things. The last point about Turkey, I'm not so sure that Turkey can be taken as a representative state for the rest of the Muslim world. It is European, it has a long history of middle class, although at certain periods went up and down. More importantly, it wants to be a member of the EU. There are compulsions for it to change many things. Thank you.
Your points are well taken, Mr. Ambassador. First of all, there is a great deal of variation in the Muslim world. Not every country is likely to be able to move in the same direction, in the same pace. Even other parts of the world, let's take Latin America. You know, Argentina came out of the gate with the spirit of globalization ahead of everybody else. Its infrastructure was better than Brazil and in some ways Chile. It had a greater European history, much better, but it fell behind. It had massive financial crisis, and then Brazil now has taken a dominant position in the region, even though on the face of it, it had many bigger problems. And then, during economic development itself has, different cycles. Leadership matters, management matters. Many countries that are doing very well today may stumble going forward. So, we should expect that, different countries will have a different sort of a trajectory going forward. But, I mean, the two countries of Pakistan and Turkey that you mentioned capture this. There are things that are particular to Turkey that won't exist in other countries, and Turkey may traverse this course much faster. But what Turkey shows, because the growth in Turkey was not did not come about by the most secular element of the society. It actually came out by small-town businessmen whose mental attitude and cultural attitudes were different. But rather it shows that, once there is an opening, an economic reform, that then you would have essentially at the center a force that would be, if you would, the main push for economic, political, cultural, and religious developments of the kind that the outside world is yearning for. Even if you looked at Pakistan, the problem in Pakistan is that its economy and its governance does not provide for these kinds of transformation. It has a fairly large middle class, but Pakistan is not integrated into the global economy. It used to be ahead of India in terms of GDP, growth rate, etc. India is now growing at 7% a year. Not all the problems in India are solved. There's still enormous amount of poverty, infrastructure problem, etc. But the transformation of India is credited again to this rise of this middle class. So if you stand back and said, okay, you have this country in Pakistan, you have the kind of extremism that we witnessed with the reaction to the murder of the governor, what would be the force? What would be the agent that could potentially turn Pakistan around? Is it somehow miraculously religious reform that's going to happen? I don't know how that would happen, given exactly the scenario you gave. So there has to be some kind of a shift in this balance, and this shift has to come from the economy. You have to have a nucleus of a case study, of a Bangalore in Pakistan that then would begin to drive the rest of the country along. Now, the fact that Pakistan has problems with electricity, that it went through a 30-year, a massive flood, that it has all kinds of issues within its social political structure, make it very difficult. But again, there is no alternative. There is no other course other than opening this economy and allowing the entrepreneurs, businessmen, and the middle class to become the driver. And the larger point you made at the beginning is exactly the crux of the problem. Namely, in the 1920s and 30s, much like Latin America or many parts of Asia, you had a situation where the government or the state took the responsibility for development. So they would decide what factory will be built, who would run it. Everybody was controlled by the government. That system has begun to fail. Now, it's been failing for quite some time, and that's why in the 1980s you had a number of countries sort of throwing their hands up and saying, we just can't do it anymore. So they went to the IMF and the World Bank, and the prescription was that you got to stop the government running the economy. You have to let the market run the economy, which means that you have to remove tariff barriers, you have to deregulate, you have to create an environment where foreign money would want to come and invest in your country. You have to do all of those things. And those countries who did it, began to see the change. Some did it more successfully than others. But in the end, the path is the fact that where the state is not capable of running the economy, the only alternative is to let the market run the economy. And the argument is that if you let the market run the economy, it's going to be a lot better. After all, let's put it this way. Everywhere else in the world, that's worked. That doesn't mean that there are no financial crises, or you're not going to have hardships, or it's not going to be difficult. But if we really dispassionately step back and not got bogged down into this sort of debate so only about religion and Islam and whether Islam is the problem or not, and we really step back, we really look at East Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, or you even looked at Europe's own history, there is no other way out of this other than doing what Turkey did. Now, I agree, Egypt or Algeria or Iran or Pakistan are going to have a really difficult time doing exactly what Turkey did in the same time frame. But that's the only path forward. And what Turkey suggests is not that Pakistan would be identical. What Turkey suggests is that Muslim believers are likely to engage the market and the global economy if you create the framework for them. And then when they do, they're going to behave in ways that the West would be, quote unquote, pleased to see them behave, which is they're going to behave in ways that everybody else behaves. Now, if we thought about most of the Muslim world and said the politics is now increasingly catering to the lowest end of the society, to the very poor, etc. So it makes for much more radical populist politics. But the politics that is associated with this middle class is quote unquote moderate, because its interests require it to be so. So the debate has to be, in my opinion, about this issue, is that you're not going to get out of this scenario without changing the economic makeup of these countries.
Okay, there's
You maybe should moderate this, because I can't see.
Nor can I, but there are many hands there. Let's start over there. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Hi, I'm Partini, graduate of the Fletcher School. In a country like, Hi, I'm Kartini, graduate of the Fletcher School. In a country like Iran, where you have an extreme dictatorship that doesn't encourage the growth of the middle class, what will it take to create real change? Would it be a social revolution in your point of view? Thank you.
Well, you know, the way in which the path forward is actually exactly what sort of should be the subject of debate. I mean, there is an argument that you know, countries like Turkey and or even Malaysia, in some ways, Muslim countries that are gone down this path can serve as a bandwagon model. That they can show a path to other countries to follow. Although that's not a given that would happen. You know, it's quite possible that a country may resist change the best it can. And the countries with a lot of petrodollars are more likely to do so because they can avoid hard economic choices. In the case of Iran, this process actually began in the 1980s. Iran, in some ways, was ahead of many of its neighbors in terms of privatization, trying to you know, pass some of the management of larger enterprises to the private sector. And as a result, it ended up creating a middle class that then became politically demanding. When oil prices went up, this process was largely reversed. I mean, the first term of President Ahmadinejad coincided with very high oil prices, and the government did not need to you know, carry out with privatization, etc. It began to backtrack. Now, you know, the Muslim world is a fairly large place, and when and if there are more experiments or more success cases with this transition, I think ultimately it will begin to create a much more diverse environment in which these issues will become debated and pursued internally within the Muslim world. There are many countries that are quite difficult to see how they will immediately in the near future make that transition. But there are many who are better candidates. Indonesia, for instance. Or in North Africa, Morocco, compared to its neighbors, has undertaken many more economic reforms. Iran is a particular case, largely because of also the current international issues that surround Iran. But it's very clearly, you know, this opening, this economic restructuring does not happen in any country unless its leadership decides that it is time to change the way they run the economy. Either they run out of money, and that's the only reason the Turks, the Argentinians, Brazilians, Mexicans did it, or that they begin to see that, you know, their neighbors are getting wealthier and are doing better. There's an ASEAN effect, for instance, you know, or in Asia, countries began to adopt policies that because they saw that they were falling behind their neighbors. I mean, in the case of Pakistan, for instance, India's growth may be actually the biggest incentive for why they may decide that they need to restructure their economies.
Yes, please.
My name is David White. I've been working in Asia for 20 years in the financial sector. I'm currently retired, but I've been active as chairman of Democrats Abroad here in Singapore, and I'm on the executive committee. I don't want to ask a long, protracted question about Afghanistan, but is there the minimum level of stability that some policies could be implemented which would foster a capitalistically oriented middle class and hopefully reduce the cronyism and corruption of the Karzai government? And you've had extensive experience, I understand, from your resume and as an advisor to the U.S. government. Is the U.S. government, do they really understand your positions, and are they amenable to at least seriously considering implementing policies which would foster what you're proposing?
No, fully well, I can't comment on that, but let me put it this way. regarding the first point you made, Afghanistan obviously has much bigger problems, which is, you cannot even have this discussion before you have security in the country. Secondly, if you looked at across the Muslim world and you were looking for some leaders, some more countries that would go through a successful transition, that then they would be, first of all, be a representative to the West to say that, look, the issues about the Muslim world are not cultural. We're not doing a religious debate here. There's another way forward, and also that they would maybe serve as an example to others. Countries like Somalia, Afghanistan, Yemen, etc., is not the place to start. This is extremely difficult. They're so far behind in terms of, Afghanistan, even if you put the war aside, was completely shattered by 3 decades of civil war. About a quarter of its population at one point in time was refugees. The 20% of the country was mined. Its agriculture was completely destroyed by a scorched earth policy. So that's not the place for us, for instance, to really put our minds to. You have to look at economies that are capable of, are close enough to actually get them over the sort of a line of transformation. And there are plenty around the Muslim world that would be candidates. And I think, that would be, you're always going to have here and there in the vast expanse of Muslim world somewhere where there's going to be a civil war or a war or some kind of a breakdown, and you have to deal with that within its own confines. But if we're talking about, bringing some kind of a broader transformative change to the way in which these large debates between Islam and the West are playing themselves out, you have to look at, say in the next 20 years, which other countries could at least emulate the Turkish model and begin to make that transformation. I mean, I think, for instance, in this region, Indonesia is a very important case to watch because it's been, even beginning with the Suharto period, it began to integrate into the global economy. It did so for 2 reasons. One is that it's running out of oil and gas, and secondly, because it's in a neighborhood of many other countries who have begun to make this transformation. So it's if, say, Indonesia succeeds to be, I'm not saying necessarily that it be Switzerland, but if Indonesia succeeds, say, in the next 10 years to be India, which has many of the same problems of corruption, lack of infrastructure, poverty, ethnic diversity, many of those issues. But India has a lot of problems. I mean, but somehow in our mindset, we see it as a brilliant, shining case. If so the example that India projects, if Indonesia were to project, it would have an enormous impact. If there were to be an Arab country that at least is gone a fair amount down this road, and we begin to see the transformation on it, it will have an impact. Afghanistan has a long road to sort of first create stability, and then 8 out of 10 Afghans rely on agriculture right now. You have to be able to return them to that livelihood before you can begin to think in terms of whether countries like Afghanistan or Yemen could get on the. But I would say actually, it's always the logic of this process has been, countries don't do these transformation voluntarily. So countries that are wealthy in commodities or have enormous amount of resources to continue to subsidize existing structures are not likely to be engaged in this process. The Gulf is not a place to look for this transformation. But North Africa has some very good candidates.
Yes, please.
My name is Abdul Halim. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation, Professor. I was thinking that it's pretty clear that economics is, even though it's an important factor, cannot be used as the end all and be all for the reasons for extremism and it seems that, I mean, you would agree with that. Only that, you know, it seems to me that your thesis develops from that idea and refines it and try to say that it's the middle class. The middle class is a stabilizing force, factor. I wonder how you actually define the middle class, given that you yourself admit that individuals in the middle class find radicalism appealing, and yet as a group, you are saying that it is a stabilizing force. That's one thing. The other thing is your comment about Dubai, that Dubai, as a matter of fact, is not really globalized. It's really outside of the process of globalization, and you're saying that this is due to the fact that Dubai, and I'm not very clear, maybe you can explain a bit more. It's about the supply chain, you know, where Dubai sits. Now, I think it was the Economist several years ago that described Singapore as the most globalized nation in the world. And as I can remember, one of the factors is that in Singapore you can find almost everything that comes from all around the world in the local supermarket. And that's one of the features of very globalized nation. I think you can find that feature at least in Dubai, and that you know, Dubai is in the supply chain of the world. Only thing that it probably is up there as an energy source. Maybe you can elaborate.
No, Dubai is part of the global supply chain, as Turkey is. What I was saying is that majority of the Muslim world is not part of this globalized chain. And where it's least part of the globalized chain, we tend to have more prevalence of what is seen as extremism. And I don't say you know, globalized chain in the sense of what you find in the supermarket. But whether or not you are part of the entire production system that you know, from the beginning to the end of a product. And Dubai does not manufacture things, but Dubai was part of the global financial supply chain. Now, to be part of the global financial supply chain, you have to change your laws. Your laws have to be the same laws as in Singapore, as in London, as in Frankfurt. Otherwise, banks cannot do business with you. Your banking system has to be part of that supply chain, which means that it has to be equally open. You have to change your ownership and property and business laws so that people who bring money or want to buy property, etc., would do that. You have to change your laws to allow direct foreign investment, ownership, joint ventures, etc. And you generally have to essentially create a regulatory environment that allows people to do business over there. So Dubai actually made itself part of the global supply chain, except the difference with, you know, maybe with larger countries or Singapore is that Dubai was not doing any manufacturing. In the manufacturing world, being part of the global supply chain is that you make a chip that goes into a larger piece of equipment in another country that then goes into a telephone that somebody in Canada would use. So you're integrated into the entire, you know, production cycle of a telephone. So, you know, old system of trade was that I give you something and I get something finished in return. So, you know, I give you oil, I get cars in return. But, you know, the globalization means that different pieces of things are built in different markets, and then, you know, markets become interdependent in that way. And your first question was, just briefly,
Finding the middle class.
well, you know, the fact that individual members of the middle class may be attracted to terrorism is like saying individual members of the middle class may be attracted to crime. And, you know, we would in the old days say that crime is a matter of poverty, like, you know, the story of Les Miserables. You know, if you're poor, you steal, or if you're poor, you engage in different vices. But, you know, how do you explain it when you know, well-to-do people end up doing criminal acts? So they're always going to be criminal people. There's a complicated reason why psychologically somebody, even though wealthy, may engage in theft, for instance, or somebody who has millions of dollars may still engage in embezzlement. The point is that you say if a society as a whole is wealthy, it's much less likely to feel that need. And the point is that, exactly the point I'm making is that generally the perception is that, that extremism either is a product of the religion itself or is a product of poverty. That's the way in which the debate is defined. And the point about it is that the middle class is that there's evidence, even when you had a similar issue with communist extremism among youth in Europe, that the middle class as a whole didn't see its interests represented or reflected in extremism, and it was not supportive of it. So the question is that if you have a large middle class that is integrated into the global economy, that is prosperous, not because of oil wealth or government handouts, but it's a generator of wealth, its attitudes towards society, politics, religion will reflect its economic interests. And many Muslim thinkers may think that that their religion is an exception to this rule, but it's not. That's exactly what Dubai and Turkey show. That Muslims are not outside of the way in which humans behave, given their interests. That people find a way to follow their faith and serve their interests as well. And extremism does not serve the interests of those who are part of part of a market economy and are prospering through market economies.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Michael Stephen. I'm a consultant. I've worked in Asia, mostly Southeast Asia, for about 35 years. And it seems to me that one of the prerequisites, perhaps the most important prerequisite for the emergence of a middle class is an adequate educational system. Certainly that's what's made it possible in this part of the world. And I'd like you to comment on how education plays into the dynamic in the Muslim world.
It's a very good point, and yes, without a doubt that education and also many other infrastructure issues are absolutely vital to this. And there are governments who have invested, in education. Clearly, are better positioned to take advantage of this. But education also works the other way around. In other words, that the larger the middle class becomes, the more demand it creates for education. And in fact, one of the things we're seeing in many parts of the Muslim world is that the middle class is the driver for education. Let's look at South Asia, for instance. And there's been a lot of debate in the West about the madrasa issue. And again, I'm not sort of debating it. If you read the newspapers, the debate is that madrasa is a consequence of poverty, right? Because people are poor, there's no public education, they send their children to religious seminaries that then they come out as radicals, and then we know the rest of the story. But even in South Asia, you see that the minute there is a middle class, it begins to demand education. And one of the most biggest businesses in South Asia is private education catering to middle class. Now, some of these are religious, some are secular, but there's a huge growth industry of people who have the means demanding education for their children. So I mean, in other words, it cuts both ways. Education helps the creation of middle class. The middle class, in turn, demands education, as well as other things that have to do with quality of life, improvement of family, etc. But if we took your point, it means that instead of again debating religion all the time, is that you want to mobilize resources to invest in these sorts of infrastructure things that would help propel the process forward.
Yes, please.
My name is Wan Hussein. I'm from the Muslim Charitable Organization. Talking about middle class, I would like to share your assessment of the Muslim middle class in Malaysia. bearing in mind that Malaysia is a player in the globalized economy and also its international image, Islamic international image is quite acceptable.
Well, Malaysia is obviously a particular case because it's a multi-ethnic society, and the sort of the first, if you would, sharp end of engagement of the global economy was actually probably the Chinese community, which was engaged in business much more early on. But ultimately, once Malaysia opened to the global economy in the 1980s, and it became a major producer and exporter of electronics and other manufactured goods, it has a similar impact. In other words, it gradually began to produce a middle class that its values may be religious. It is much like the Turkish model that I was saying. But it again is performing the same kind of a role in society. In other words, its attitudes towards politics, its attitudes towards global economy, it's the way it promotes its interests. It plays in the same way. I mean, the only difference between Malaysia and Turkey is the inter-ethnic issues in Malaysia that gives an added, if you would, complexity to the discussion. But I think it's performed in the same way. And again, some of the ideas that are, for instance, associated with intellectuals in Turkey today who argue for a globalization-friendly Islam, emphasis on Islamic values, but supporting capitalism, etc., were, a staple of the Mahathir period. I mean, Anwar Ibrahim's book about Asian Renaissance, it's you could say it's the mantra of the AKP party. I always say actually many of its intellectuals of the AKP party, because during those time periods they couldn't teach in universities in Turkey, all went to Malaysia. And were working in Malaysia, saw the Malaysian experiment up close, and what they saw in the formulation in Malaysia was that you had a globalization-friendly interpretation of Islam that saw Islam as values, not political action. Argued that capitalism and globalization is compatible with Islam, and was pushing for quote-unquote Malay capitalism. But Malay capitalism was what? Was creation of a Malay middle class. That some of those ideas, in a sense, was transferred over there. And in many ways, if you would, both Mahathir and Anwar Ibrahim were the early, if you would, promoters of the same idea. Now, again, sometimes events happen that have an impact. There was an Asian financial crisis, and there was an internal political turmoil that led to fall of Anwar from its political power. Malaysia lost its footing for a time period. Its economic growth slowed down, but ultimately the trend is still there. I mean, Malaysia is still it's a country that needs globalization to generate wealth. And it needs business to generate wealth, and it has to be. It still has to produce things that you find in Apple computer or Dell. It has to do those things, which means that the same dynamic is at work.
Yes, please, Mr. Talib.
Thank you. I'm Saad Talib. I'm from the Middle East, from Yemen. I was a member of Parliament in Yemen. I'm very interested, actually. I've done a lot of research on reform, but specifically under state capture. That's why it got to be very interesting. What you are calling for is, or that's what I understood, is that reform should be started by the economic sector and by opening up the market. In other words, even before political reform, which is the liberalization of the economy, of the political system. That is, as I understood, or as I read, is a big problem. It comes to mind Anwar Sadat in the 70s. He, of course, took Egypt and went to create a liberal economy, which was captured by his own people, which took the country to a great decline. Even today, Egypt is still in the same place. And exactly, I think Mubarak's son is calling for the same that. We cannot have political liberalization before economic liberalization, but only for his very good friends. Now, that, there is a study that I've read that always under state capture by regimes that are like that, and most of the rentier states that you've mentioned, where they just take the oil and then they control politics and economy, they always, when they mention reform, they always go for what is called partial reform. And then the captors of the state prevent any further reform because it will begin to affect their power. Now, that does not create a middle class, it creates an angry population. This is what I want you to further explain. How can a middle class be created unless there is some political liberalization like it is in Turkey, the example you've mentioned? And as far as Dubai is concerned, actually the Arabs in Dubai, or the local people of Dubai, are only 5%, and they're quite detached from what is happening in Dubai. So 95% of the residents of Dubai and the investors are all foreigners. So it's not really a local entity. It is like an international thing planted in that area. So yeah. So, but basically, my main concern is this: what can happen without political liberalization, taking away from going away from the dictatorships and the familial rule that covers many areas. And I take to point also the case of Afghanistan. I mean, everybody knows that that the amount of corruption, it has a very, very long way to go. And it will not happen until such political system is amended or changed or reformed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, no, all of your points are well taken. First of all, about Dubai, I do agree with you. I mean, Dubai's main, the reason I refer to Dubai is largely, as I said, it's a proof of concept about Muslims being capable of behaving in capitalist ways if they are given the opportunity. So, you know, it's you know, Muslims in other countries where they cannot do that, say from Yemen, from Iran, from Pakistan, when they go to Dubai, because that opportunity exists, we see that they behave like everybody else. So you know, what Dubai really shows is that Muslims are not an exception, if you would, in terms of the way in which they may be viewed outside. The other issue you raise is actually it's a big issue. It's a big debate, because there are countries that made the transformation under dictatorship, like South Korea, or like even Turkey. You know, the economic reform began before political reform. It began during the period of General Evran, who was, you know, ruled Turkey after the coup of 1980. And then there are countries where the reverse is true. For instance, in Latin America, largely, the minute that they had to go to the IMF, the generals all left. And immediately there were elections in Argentina, in Brazil, etc. And in those cases, there was an argument that Democrats actually had a better chance of getting the population to make key economic concessions, because there was some trust issue that no longer existed with dictators. So, you know, there is, in debates, you know, both sides are there. And I think country by country may be different. The case of Egypt, you say, is very apt. You know, in other words, if you have partial reform, and I really don't think, you know, Sadat actually did liberalize the economy, though he called it. It was a transformation that allowed him to bring money from the outside to subsidize the same entity. In other words, the structure of business, joint ventures, the way in which large enterprises were run, none of it changed. No large enterprises under Sadat were privatized.
Steel industry is owned by one.
Oh, I agree. In other words, what happened under Sadat, in fact, Sadat went to IMF in 1977, long before Turkey and long before Argentina. And the IMF told them two things: cut the bread subsidy and cut the fuel subsidy, similar to what happened in Pakistan. There were riots, just like there were riots in Pakistan. And Sadat decided it's easier to go to Jerusalem than to do this. And the IMF package that was given to Sadat in '77 for the first time began to be implemented in 1997 by Mubarak, and then not fully. So Egypt found ways to postpone the reforms, largely because it had ability to attract foreign aid after it made peace with Israel, and then opened itself to tourism. So money began to come, and then they postponed it. The reforms currently, some of them have been good, but they're not enough. In other words, the Egyptian economy has not really been opened up. I mean, when Brazil went through economic reform, they actually created a ministry of deregulation. And an entire ministry was created in charge of cutting the red tape in the economy. What do you call it, tariffs and regulations and rules were torn down. In Argentina, the national airlines was put up for sale and privatized. The steel industries, large industries, car industries, they all were put up for sale. And the first thing that international investors ask you if you ask them to put money is you got to change your laws. The two laws that they immediately ask you to change is ownership laws and arbitration laws. Nobody's going to put money anywhere if they don't trust that the legal system is going to protect them, and if they don't have a right to proper ownership. These changes have not happened. So yes, you can always go get money and say, some foreign money can put investment in a particular venture, but that's not the same kind of a transformation. And you're right. I mean, the corruption is an issue, but I think corruption. Ultimately, it is a big problem. Sometimes it become a monumental problem. But in many countries that we also think are doing extremely well, you still have corruption of various sorts in third world countries. And ultimately, you have to continue to pass laws and change these issues. The fundamental issue that you're mentioning is that, look, governments and those who own things have no incentive to change. And if they can resist it, they will. I mean, the businessmen in Turkey did not want state subsidies to finish. But at some point, there was absolutely no option left. And therefore, when the military came in, it made a commitment to support Turkey Özal implement these things. We could sort of debate as to whether that kind of a incentive or pressure exists in countries. I don't know. I mean, we can see whether in Tunisia, for instance, the government will come to a conclusion that it can no longer sustain the current system, and they would have to undergo transformation. But if democratic change, political liberalization comes before economic reform, it's much, much better. But economic reform will likely make dictatorship of the kind that existed unsustainable, because you cannot open the economy and change all the laws and rules and the same system to survive. But there is a valid debate as to which should come first.
My contention is it won't happen. That's all my contention.
I have a question. I want to get a question in
Sure,
before we have to close. And I've been looking at the title of your talk, and I'm thinking if we had a really ruthless copy editor here, we might, want to rewrite that a little bit, especially after an extremely interesting and lovely sort of comparative survey. If you look at it quickly, and maybe I oversimplify, but I get the impression that we're being offered a thesis that things are getting better in this particular part of the world. We have the rise of capitalism, new Muslim middle class, ideological shift, and it sounds like the trend is, is toward the glass as half full rather than the glass being half empty, which is, of course, what most of us actually think. And if you were to copy edit it a little bit, couldn't you rewrite it to say economics of the kind that is happening out there supports extremism? Yeah, of course, the middle class always produces terrorists and there are just individuals and so forth, but out of what you might say the rise of, for the most part, defective capitalism, because it's not yet producing the good kind of middle class that you talked about as opposed to the bad kind of state-dominated middle class. Couldn't you, argue that really the glass is half empty? Because if you were to look across the region, you would say, well, yeah, of course there's Dubai, but as I think has been pointed out, Dubai is, first of all, a very small place, and it's certainly not really very Arab, and is it really very Muslim? Maybe, maybe not. Turkey, maybe Turkey is the exception that proves the rule, because if you look across the region, you see, we've seen you mention yourself, riots lately in Tunisia and Algeria. You see the birth pangs of struggle and the tensions of economies that are slowly becoming more capitalist and more globalized, but it's a very tough road. It's a really rough transformation, and it's apparently a very slow transformation. And societies and economies that have had the benefits of the Washington Consensus, of course, produce a lot of tensions between within a would-be middle class and a poor class that is getting poorer. And if you go across North Africa, all the way across, if you look at Egypt, if you look at Syria is a place where there's been some capitalism, but only a very tough government has suppressed Muslim extremism there. And if you go across to the Gulf, is it not true that most of the funding for what we call Islamist extremism comes out of these rich and surely mostly middle class or upper middle class circles where the money is, because the governments are absolutely afraid of Islamic extremism? And if you move across to Iran, well, there's an Iranian middle class that was supporting Islamist causes even under the Shah. And then you have Pakistan, a big problem. It's only finally, perhaps when you get into Southeast Asia, that you have a couple of cases, Malaysia, Indonesia, where it seems to be working. Although I must say recently I heard a Singaporean minister with responsibilities for security looking at a large map of this neighborhood and worrying out loud about the extent and perhaps the growth of Islamist extremism in Indonesia and Malaysia in particular, a perceived problem at least. So what I'm wondering is, as you look across the region, the image of the title is things are getting better, but are they really? I'm not entirely convinced that's the case. And then the last point, what is the word Muslim doing in here? What is the Islamic factor? Couldn't you simply remove that word and say economics versus maybe extremism, rise maybe of capitalism that's defective, the new, cross that word out, the new middle class, an ideological shift in countries of North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Because the rise of a new Muslim class in a Muslim country, what does that tell us?
Well, let me begin with the last point. First of all, the rise of this middle class is generating actually ideological debates across the Muslim world. In other words, there is one level of debate is about what Al-Qaeda says, etc. But the questions about relationship of faith to politics, faith to society, etc. Some of it is not limited to particular countries. It crosses the Muslim world. I mean, the point I was making about debates in Malaysia in the 1980s, transferring to Turkey. Now, Turkey is again itself is becoming a point of debate. For instance, in the last elections in Malaysia, there was a faction within the PAS party called the Erdogan faction, and the Malaysian and the Turkish model now was debated back there, and then say within the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, there is all kinds of debate about you know, the Turkish model, or the Peace and Justice Party in Morocco, which actually has named itself almost after the AKP party. Again, you know, vehemently in last elections debated, you know, whether they should stick to old form fundamentalism or to, you know, to adopt a Turkish model. So I mean, there's a level of debate that is both government circles among intellectuals, particularly Islamist intellectuals, are also debating these issues. So at that level, you know, it is not as a powerful a force as fundamentalism, but it's clearly sort of its cross boundaries. And you know, often in the Muslim world, intellectual trends are not limited to one country. I mean, this is a sort of a globalized debate going back and forth. Now, you know, there has always been a middle class in the Muslim world. The middle class of the Shah's period was not a bourgeoisie. It was much like many middle classes, or the old Kemalist middle class. It was not connected to the market. It grew wealthy. It was produced by state power and the like. But what is new in the Muslim world is is the rise of a middle class that is connected to markets, and then the ideas that it's fostering and attitudes that it is fostering towards politics is new. And the term rise is not necessarily in the sense of size, but it is in terms of a different point of debate in the Muslim world. Now, I agree with you that, you know, in much of the Muslim world, you know, there is the governments are actually resisting change. And fundamentalism ideologically still is a powerful foe. Even you know, the example of Amar Khalid I gave, you know, for one Amar Khalid there is like 20 Yusuf Qaradawis still. But the fact that either for the first time you do have an Amar Khalid, or that you do have a Fethullah Gulen as an alternative to these voices is important. And then the question is, the other issue is that I agree that the news in much of the Muslim world is pretty depressing, and that you know, you still, particularly in the Arab world, have these closed, malfunctioning economies, you know, with very little prospect of change. But there is no other, if you would, out other than this form of some kind of a structural reform that would empower this middle class. And also, I think you know, there are factors that are happening that are key. For instance, you know, the downturn in the European economy will put a very different spin on the prospects for North Africa. I mean, for instance, the Moroccans had made significant amount of investment in having a relationship with Spain and Portugal, which is similar to Mexico's with the United States, that would, you know, absorb their labor, invest in them. It's now, given what's happening in Portugal and Spain, it's open to question whether they would provide that drive going forward. So, you know, I take your point that you know, we were not dealing with a tidal wave of change here. We have some important cases, you know, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Turkey, Dubai, as I said, is not a self-sustaining model. It's mostly pure, is a proof of concept that if the opportunity existed, the engagement would happen. And then we have pockets within different countries that are not at a critical position to make a change yet, but they might. I mean, the Iranian middle class or middle classes in the Arab world may begin to play this role if there is a shift in position. But the word rise does not mean that it's about to overwhelm. It really means that it is a phenomenon that didn't exist before. And it's emerging, and the culture and the politics and the attitudes that this new middle class has or is associated with it is, if you would, a new blimp on the radar in the region. And I have to say that the news in the Arab world is far more. The challenge is far bigger. The prospect is far smaller than outside of the Arab world.
There's one more, we're over time, but I'll take one last question, please.
Thank you, Professor. You mentioned 2 points I would like to raise here. There's an assumption, first of all, it sounds a bit contradictory. Bin Laden himself, the biggest terrorist in the world, comes from a very rich family in Saudi Arabia. He also, his forefathers came from Yemen, as you know. That's one. Number 2, you seem to have an assumption or the notion that the Arab world is so engrossed in the debate on Islamic issues, they forgot to address the issue of economic strategy. The fault lies not with there's no such obsession with the debate. The fault lies, I think, the Arab society is not functioning, is being underpinned by the despotic royal families in Saudi Arabia, for one, and some despots in Egypt and in Tunisia and so on and so on. They multiply that many times. And they're being supported by American hegemony. And that's the greatest joke. And the Americans enjoying, of course, they have reasons for that, to protect the interests. The interest being the future of oil, the stability of the petroleum markets in the world, and as mentioned many times, the security of the state of Israel. So then another gentleman raised the question of education.
Let me, because I'll forget your. Because I'll forget. I'll come back to you. Let me, because I'll forget. Because I'll forget what you said at the beginning. Let me answer this first, and then. First of all, yes, Bin Laden proves the concept I was saying, that you can have individual wealthy people who may engage in these acts, and Bin Laden's personal history is actually quite complicated. I mean, he went to Afghanistan at age 17. He and there might be many. Right. Well, that's the point about the relationship between class and extremism is a different issue. Secondly, I don't think that the monarchies of the Gulf and the societies of the Gulf are representative of what I'm saying, because when you have wealth created by oil and it's handed down by governments.
But these elite societies have this.
The reason why they're elite is a different issue. But what I'm trying to say is that that's not the middle class I'm talking about, because they're not generating wealth. There's a big difference between that middle class and middle classes in other countries. So wealth in itself is not an indicator.
My last point, the people who generated wealth in Saudi Arabia are the Yemenis, who hail from the Laden town.
Yes.
And in fact, in Southeast Asia here, the same story. I'm one of the Quran.
Why don't we leave it at that?
Our forefathers had no education when they came here. They were well created.
No, I agree. Yeah.
And we occupy 45% of the real estate in Singapore.
Okay. All right. I think we've established that important.
No, I'm sure if the economy opened up in Saudi Arabia in the way I'm saying, the Yemenis would do even better.
And on that happy note, I would like to thank Vali and Nasr for an excellent presentation. It is our custom to give a present to someone who gives a really good lecture.
Thank you.
Please join us outside for a cup of tea and you can continue the discussion.